I'd like to present to you Ambassador Francois Zimeray. He's the Ambassador of France for Human Rights. He was a mayor in France at the age of 27, and at 37 became a member of the European Parliament, the youngest member of the Socialist delegation. He is a longtime human rights activist for victims in Darfur, Laos, and Congo, and for the cause of the Middle East peace. I'd like to call him up here so he can say his final remarks. And then we'll be hearing from another ambassador, and then we're all done.
Bien.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say first and foremost that it's a real privilege to be able to speak to you this evening at the end of a day which I know has been extremely rich and very interesting. We can all feel it more or less clearly. We are not experiencing a moment which is the usual sort of moment, because we are now on the eve of a day which might be historical. This evening I would have liked to give you the definitive position of France, but unfortunately we'll have to wait a little bit, because the French position has not yet been finally decided on. There are still consultations going on, and after all, this is quite normal in view of what is at stake and in view of how complex the situation is that we are facing. Complexity is really the key word. We're in a world which requires simplicity, which rejects complexity, which is calling for obviousness. And yet I would like to point to our approach and our view of this complexity. I believe in symbols, and I am not unaffected by the fact, I read this in the train, that in a few days from now, at the very time when the conference, Durban Review Conference, will come to an end, the court case of the presumed murderer of Ilan Halimi will start. Those of you who have not followed this case might want a few explanations. Ilan Halimi was a young French Jew, or Jewish Frenchman. What he wanted was simply live an ordinary life, happy in his country. Unfortunately, on his way, he came across someone who was from Africa, who lived in France in a less than pleasant neighborhood, who felt discriminated against. And this person, coming from Africa, had got it into his head that there was one main cause which was responsible for his unhappiness, namely the Jews. A few years ago, I saw some of you here already, I spoke of the Durbanization of people's views there were some ideas which were not in the final text of the conference, but now, 8 years later, everything is somehow amalgamated. All the ideas coming from this Durban 1 conference amalgamated with all the cries of death to the Jews which were heard outside of the conference. The conference was supposed to deal with all the victims of discrimination and racism, and these people found a scapegoat for their suffering and for their difficulties, and the scapegoat was Israel, it was the Jewish people, and in fact the word laboratory of hatred was mentioned. Now the official conference and the forum of the NGOs form one single entity, even if historically speaking there are two different meetings. The speeches are not the same and the attitudes are different, but nevertheless one sees them as one whole. And today, very clearly, the images of Durban 1 are coming back, are reflected in the waters of Lake Geneva, and we can feel this intense emotion that was generated by Durban 1. This was first, it was covered up by something which happened only a few hours or few days afterwards, after Durban 1, namely the assassination of Commander Massoud, and then the 11th of September. So now you have the feeling that the words preceded the actions. This anti-Jewish and anti-Western discourse really gave courage to the terrorists of the 11th of September. Of course, there's no real link, but the image that lingers with us is that there is a link. So we are fully aware of the moral dimension, which is traumatic. The moral dimension of Durban 1. And this is how we are going to the so-called follow-up review conference. France, through the voice of first the Prime Minister, through the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister, has contributed for Europe to draw up some very, very clear red lines, and you mentioned these today. These red lines were first and foremost the choice of the conference venue. We did not want this conference to be held in a country where fundamental rights are not guaranteed, and where one could say anything one wanted out in the streets, and where again there could be such a forum of hatred as there was at Durban 1. The red line, and we've had this distinction because we envisaged Durban again as a venue, possibly Tripoli, and we decided that it would be Geneva. Another red line, not reopen the conference agenda and reintroduce this notion of blasphemy or defamation of religion, which I call blasphemy. Not to have this on the international agenda, the international legal agenda, and we've had the satisfaction of not seeing this. Third line, red line, we refuse the stigmatization of Israel, not just because it means anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but because the world has a right to have a reflection of the real violations of human rights shown to it, and not some kind of obsessional fantasy which uses the Jews and Israel as a scapegoat in order to cover up the real and very serious violations of human rights throughout the world.